Hey everyone, this is Scott. If you are watching on YouTube, this is the first video interview I have done. And I'm going to be speaking with author David Nasaw, who's going to be looking at something that I think a lot of us know about if we've researched World War II, but we really don't understand how influential it is today. And that's the millions of refugees that were left behind following the end of World War II, the displaced persons. This starts in May 1945 when German forces surrendered to Allied powers, which put an end to World War II in Europe. But the global conflict didn't end with just Germany's surrender. That's because there were millions of lost and homeless concentration camp survivors, POWs, slave laborers, political prisoners, and Nazi collaborators who may have arrived at a refugee camp and changed their identity completely. Many of these people in Central and Eastern Europe were fleeing the Red Army that were overwhelming Germany. So, what happened to all of these people? Where did they go? What do you do if your home is completely destroyed? What if you hate Germany and renounce it, but you're in a refugee camp in Germany? Where do you go? At first, British and American soldiers gathered these malnourished and desperate refugees and they tried to repatriate them. But after all of these efforts, there were more than 1 million people who couldn't or didn't want to be repatriated. They were Jews, Poles, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and other Eastern Europeans who didn't want to go home or had no homes to go to. So these last million who couldn't be repatriated right after the war spent the next 3 to 5 years in displaced persons camps. They were in their temporary homelands in exile. They were divided by nationality in these camps. And after a while, they started to create their own little civilizations. They had their own police forces. They had their own churches and synagogues and schools and newspapers and theaters and infirmaries. And these little model United Nations were set up here. Well, the international community couldn't agree on the fate of the last million. And after a year of debate and inaction, the International Refugee Organization that was created to resettle these people, mostly on lands that suffered from post-war labor shortages and needed to rebuild their industry, started to accept them. And interestingly enough, Latvians were the most popular group. Many of them hadn't suffered slave labor during the war. They were still in good shape. They were Protestants, so that was better to Protestant nations. Then other Eastern Europeans, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians started to be accepted in Canada, in South America, in Australia, and elsewhere. But no nation was willing to accept the 200 to 250,000 Jewish men, women, and children who remained trapped in Germany. In 1948, the United States, which were among the last countries to accept refugees for resettlement, finally passed a displaced persons bill. But what's interesting is that with the Cold War fears that were replacing memories of World War II atrocities, the bill gave a vast number of the visas to those who were reliably anti-communist, and this included thousands of former Nazi collaborators and war criminals, while limiting the entry of Jews, many of whom were expected of being communist sympathizers or agents because they were recently residents of Soviet-dominated Poland. Only after the partition of Palestine and Israel's decision to declare independence in 1948, this was when the remaining Jews were able to leave their displaced persons camps in Germany and finally find a home. So by 1952, these last million were scattered around the world, and as they crossed from their past into the future, they had to deal with all of these issues. And the after effects of this went on for decades and are still going on today with things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So with this interview, David Nasaw and I will look at this history, what current displaced persons issues like the millions of Syrians who fled there in civil war and went to Europe, what that means for today, and the lessons we can learn. So I hope you enjoyed this interview with David Nasaw. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, your book covers a large topic involving the lives of millions of people, and we're still experiencing the fallout today. But I'm curious, as a fellow author, a lot of times there's usually a story or a data point that I come across that makes me realize I don't have the complete story. There's something much larger here that I'm missing, and I think a lot of other people are missing this as well. What got you into this book topic initially? Was there a particular story that made you realize that what we know of refugees following World War II is much more important than we've ever properly given it credit?
I think the genesis of this book has been many years. I know living in New York, I've read the stories of Holocaust survivors. I've met a couple, I've met their children. And it dawned on me that most of them arrived in New York in 1949, 1950, 1951. And I sort of filed that away as a mystery, as a question in the back of my head, didn't think much of it. And then I began, in the course of my book about Joseph P. Kennedy, I wrote a biography of Joseph P. Kennedy, to pay more and more attention to the immediate post-war period. And I realized, maybe through the story of Jack Kennedy, who came back from the war, destroyed, devastated, with malaria and any number of other diseases and traumas. It occurred to me that I wanted to look more into the end of the war. And I wanted to discover what happened after VE Day. To what extent did the war end with the cessation of hostilities for the millions of civilians who had been displaced by the war and during the war?
Well, this is a very large topic, and as your book title mentions, this is millions of people, and dealing with the last million was the final stages of this process. Could you give me a rundown of major groups of refugees? I mean, we're talking people all over Eastern and Central Europe and elsewhere, but who were these major groups of displaced people, and how did they become displaced?
There are three major groups of displaced persons that make up the refugee population in Germany at the end of the war. The largest group are the Eastern Europeans, mostly Poles and Ukrainians, who had been kidnapped, I don't know any other word to use, by the Germans from the beginning of the war to the end of the war to serve as forced laborers, as slave laborers in Germany. We've got to remember that millions, 4 million German soldiers fought on the Eastern Front, and the German army was many millions more. Their jobs, their work in the fields, in the mines, in the mills, in the factories, in the shops, had to be taken over by someone. And what the Germans did was they kidnapped a labor force in Eastern Europe and brought that labor force into Germany. That's the first group of displaced persons. They enter from 1940 on. At the end of the war, 1944, 1945, as the Red Army is pushing westward into the Baltic states that the Germans occupied, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine, tens of thousands of civilians who had, in one way or another, collaborated with the Nazi occupation, or for one reason or another, feared their safety under a Soviet-dominated government. In 1944, 1945, they packed up their belongings and they left for Germany, where they hoped they would be safe from the Red Army and from whatever retribution came their way as a result of their collaboration. There's a third group of refugees, and these are the Jewish survivors. As the war comes to an end, the Nazis want to bury forever any remnant of the concentration camps and the death camps in Poland, mostly in Poland, some in the Balkans, some in the Baltics. So they begin to remove, to death march, from Auschwitz, from Birkenau, from the other camps, the survivors. And their intent isn't to rescue them, to save them, but to kill them in a different way. And they say that. The Nazis are going to, rather than gas the remaining Jews, they're going to work them to death in the underground munitions factories that Hitler believes are going to produce a miracle weapon to win the war. So hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors are literally marched hundreds of miles from Poland into Germany to be worked to death. Half of them die along the way.
And these are millions and millions of people. The Allies and America have a reparation plan at the end. What was the plan, and how does it become clear very quickly that this plan is not going to work?
Yeah. Roosevelt, who is prescient in so many ways, in 1943, understands that when the war is over, there are going to be millions of refugees. They're going to have to be cared for. And he puts together a United Nations organization, UNRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And this is a UN organization that's formed before this, the United Nations. And UNRWA and the Americans and the British soldiers round up the displaced persons, the last million, who refuse to go home again when the war is over, or have no homes to go home to return to. And they round them up, they sort them out, they feed them, they give them medical help, and they put them in camps, most of them in Germany. The plan is to send them home. The plan is to repatriate them, all except for the Jews. But what happens is it quickly becomes clear that there are 1 million refugees who refuse to go home. Some of them because they fear that they will be punished for their collaboration. Others because they have been convinced by anti-communist elements in London, in the camps in Germany, that their countries have been taken over by the Soviets, and that there is no freedom, there is no prosperity, that to return to Poland after being away for 5 years is to return to a tyranny, to a prison camp, which is not necessarily the case. But these last million refugees remain in Germany when the war is over.
I had a guest who talked about what happened to many Jews after the Holocaust, and for many of them, they try to go back to their homes, but maybe their property, their apartments have been claimed by others. Some of them were even killed when they tried, and I couldn't imagine that you face the worst suffering that anyone could ever imaginably face, and then you still aren't finished. It's still going on. Were there any stories that stuck out to you of people trying to return to their homeland, but they realized that they didn't have a home to go back to?
Oh, there were so many stories that have been collected by archivists, by oral historians, by Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. And they all tell the same story. I'll tell you one. Bluma Domen, a young Polish girl, had been taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau with her family. The entire family was killed during the war, except for a brother who had escaped into the Soviet Union. She had promised her father when they were separated at Auschwitz that when the war is over, she would go home again. And anybody from the family who survived would go home and they would meet again in her hometown. When the war was over, instead of going into one of the displaced persons camps, she, with a group of other young Polish girls, walked back. They hitched rides on trucks, but for the most part, they walked hundreds of miles back to Poland. She went to her apartment building where the family had lived, knocked on the front door. A Polish woman came and said, "You don't live here anymore. There are no Jews here anymore," and slammed the door in her face. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories like this. When the Jews leave Poland, their lands, their apartments, their factories, their shops are taken over by Poles. When the war is over, Poland is decimated. And the Poles who have survived because they had stolen Jewish property, Jewish land, are unwilling to give it back. And in part, their guilt at knowing they had stolen this leads to a hatred for the Jews. The post-war anti-Semitism and the post-war pogroms in Poland are absolutely frightful. And for hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews, including those who had survived because they escaped and spent the war working in the Soviet Union, mostly in the Asiatic parts of the Soviet Union, and then returned to Poland, only to discover that there was no safety there. They could not rebuild their lives in Poland. And they escaped. They crossed borders in the still of the night because the only place they felt safe was behind barbed wire, in camps in Germany, the land of their murderers, where they would now be watched over by the Americans.
I'm curious what daily life looked like for both the displaced and those in the villages, those who were settled and witnessed these displaced people. So let's start with the latter first and then come up to the former. What did it look like in Central Germany or Central Europe, in Poland, in Germany, in the years immediately after the war? If you were in a village, would you see groups of orphans or displaced people walking around? What was that scene like?
When the war was over immediately, in the first months after the war, the streets, the marketplaces, the highways, the railroad stations were filled by bedraggled, suffering, homeless, starving people in rags. The forced laborers and the guest laborers, prisoners of war, political prisoners, concentration camp survivors. And the Allies gathered them up, and the Americans and the British gathered them up, put them onto trucks, took them to assembly centers, and then put them into camps. Everybody in Germany, certainly in Bavaria, they knew that the former army barracks, hotels, resorts, sometimes small towns, had been taken over by the Allies and were now populated by displaced persons. The Germans wanted nothing to do with these displaced persons. The displaced persons wanted nothing to do with the Germans. They communicated only through the black market. The rations that the displaced persons got were not enough to keep body and soul together. So they had no choice but to go onto the black market. And the Germans could only survive, the German civilians, by selling to the people in the displaced persons camps. The displaced persons found the strength to put themselves, their families, and their communities back together again within the camps. So the Ukrainian camp became a little Ukraine. The Latvian camp became a little Latvia. The Jewish settlements became places where the survivors, and they called themselves the surviving remnant, tried to rescue Judaism. It was the only way they could say to Hitler, you lost. You tried to destroy the Jews, but we're here and we will survive.
And I'm really curious, what was daily life like for a displaced person? I mean, you mentioned this kind of civilization rebuilding effort that's happening in these camps. So what was it like for somebody in these camps, or maybe somebody who's not in these camps? Are they going from town to town, begging for food, trying to find a home? What's it like?
The large majority of the displaced persons understand that if they're going to feed themselves, Germany is starving. German civilians are starving. Germany has been absolutely destroyed. And the only way the displaced persons are going to survive is by going into the camps and getting food from the Allies and being protected by UNRA, the United Nations organization, and the German soldiers, and the American soldiers and the British. So they established these communities, and in these communities, in the camps, they set up schools, hospitals, dining rooms. They rebuild their lives. Large numbers of the displaced persons work in the camps, keeping those villages in exile together. There are churches, there are recreation leagues, there are dances, there are cultural activities. In the Jewish camps, there are boxing tournaments. There are attempts to return to some kind of normalcy within the camps. And to some extent, it works.
Right. I mean, and this is a 21st century thing where there are people who will live for years in legal limbo. When I lived in Turkey, there were Iraqis from the first Gulf War who in the early 2000s, 10 years afterwards, were still in Turkey working on the gray market or the black market, were legally tolerated, but they had no pathway to citizenship. And it's amazing how resourceful people are in these situations.
Yeah, the displaced persons didn't want anything to do with Germany. They refused German citizenship. One of the problems in the Jewish camps were that when the survivors got married, they refused to marry legally because to do so would have recognized the authority of the Germans. So, thousands of children who were born in the displaced persons camps, their parents weren't legally married. The Poles wanted nothing to do with the Germans either. But they had no choice but to deal with them. In the beginning, German civilians guarded these camps until the Americans removed the Germans from the camps and allowed the camps to police themselves.
What was UNRWA thinking? How did their plans change when they realized, okay, we can't send these people back. Either they have no home or they refuse to go to their home in Germany or elsewhere. What are their early solutions? Why do those solutions fail? And what did they ultimately come to?
Yeah, UNRWA believes, and UNRWA's mandate is repatriation, is to send everybody home. UNRWA is an emergency relief organization, and it's only supposed to stay in power for a year or so after the war is over and then be dissolved. And it quickly becomes, the hostilities cease in May. There's no way to get the Polish civilians back to Poland before the winter, and they can't be moved during the winter. And UNRWA, within 6 months, discovers that they're going to be left with a million refugees, the last million, as they refer to them and as I refer to them in the title of my book. UNRWA doesn't know what to do. It feeds, it clothes, it takes care of these people, but its mandate is to repatriate them. The Americans and the British understand pretty quickly that UNRWA is not going to solve the problems, in large part because UNRWA is an international organization, which includes the Soviets and delegates from the Soviet bloc. And the Soviets say, we have no business, the international community has no business feeding and sheltering these displaced persons, send them home. If they don't want to go home, it's because they're too lazy to work rebuilding their countries or they're war criminals. The Americans and the British say, no, we're not sending people who don't want to go back to a communist-dominated country back. This is the Cold War, and no American government is going to send a Pole back to a communist-dominated Poland if it can be held. So the Americans and the British are instrumental in setting up a new international organization, IRO, the International Refugee Organization, and its mandate is not repatriation, but resettlement. And the nations that belong to UNRWA, and remember, the Soviets don't join. The Soviets don't believe these people should be resettled anywhere, but should be sent home. The nations of the world that join UNRWA, all the nations of Latin America, the British Commonwealth, and the United States, they begin to prepare to resettle these people. There is a labor shortage in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in South America. And the Argentinians, the Brazilians, the Australians, the Canadians, the Venezuelans send labor recruiters into the camps, and they pick and choose. They say, we need miners, we need forest rangers, we need railroad workers, we need agricultural workers. And they choose among the displaced persons, and they say, we'll take you. Come to Brazil. And if it works out, in 6 months, you can bring your family in. Come to Canada and work on the railroads. And in this way, from 1947, 1948 on, the able-bodied, the strongest, the hardiest of the displaced persons are given places to resettle.
Well, I'm interested in these types of population movements because we understand immigrant communities in America, of course, the historical Little Italies all over the place, the Chinatowns and major metropolitan areas. Are there any immigrant communities that you saw in Latin America or elsewhere that surprised you? A little Ukraine in Caracas, Venezuela, or something like that jumped out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was astonished at the Ukrainian community in Canada. It's a huge community. The large numbers of Latvians and Lithuanians moved to Australia. Australia feels that it needs laborers. If ever there is a World War III, Australia has to build up its population to survive. And they recruit large numbers of Latvians, Lithuanians, and Poles. The first choice among all the labor recruiters are the Latvians. Why? Because they had come into Germany at the end of the war. They hadn't suffered as guest laborers or slave laborers or as concentration victims, concentration camp victims. So the Latvians were also Protestant, and the Protestant nations of the world preferred to bring in these Latvians. After the Latvians, they would take the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, but no one wanted the Jews. And as a result, the Jewish community remained in the camps after all the other groups had started to leave.
Right. And I was interested when I saw that there was an unintended consequence of this resettlement process, that World War II politics are replaced by Cold War politics, where you could have former Nazi sympathizers who step in line in front of Jewish communities who are thought to possibly have sympathies for Soviet Russia or Soviet dominated Poland. What did that look like when these Cold War politics descend on resettlement?
You know, it for me, it was the most distressing part of this story. Large number of collaborators and war criminals make their way into Germany. They recreate their pasts. They say that instead of working for the Nazis during the war or serving as auxiliary policemen, they have been farmers or factory workers. They take on new names and new identities. They become displaced persons and then are relocated to the United States. And they are allowed into the United States because they are demonstrably anti-Soviet, anti-communist. The Jews, it is feared, because they all, or almost all of them, came from Poland and or had sheltered in the Soviet Union for large parts of the war. They were accused on the basis of one of the oldest of anti-Semitic myths, of being Bolsheviks, of being radicals, of being anti-Western civilization, of being clannish. And the countries of the world, kept them out. The result was that as more and more displaced persons were let into the United States, more collaborators and war criminals entered than Jews. And this was a consequence that some of the Jewish activists and the Nazi hunters realized right away. And they said to the American Displaced Persons Commission, you've got to screen these people before we give them visas. And the only way to screen them is to involve the concentration camp survivors who know who the criminals were. Involve them in the screening process in some way. We know that the Soviets have captured Nazi archives, and they have lists. We know that Simon Wieseltier in Austria has lists of war criminals who are disguised as displaced persons. Consult with them. Question the displaced persons before you let them into this country. And the United States refused to do it. The only country that did a reasonable job was Canada, and the Royal Mounted Police was sent to Germany to investigate, to explore, and to make sure that no war criminals were allowed to get visas to Canada.
And the final settlement of these Jewish people, all I know is that many of them end up in Israel. I don't exactly know when. That leads to a large part of the Jewish population growth, and then Israel declares independence in 1948. So, as you can see, my knowledge of this is scattered and hazy. So, could you connect the dots for me? What happens to this Jewish population whom nobody wants to accept, as opposed to these other ethnic communities?
Yeah, there are 250,000 Jews in the displaced persons camps in Germany. And as the Latvians and the Ukrainians are accepted for resettlement in Brazil and Argentina and Canada and Australia, the only way for the Jews to leave is by illegally entering Palestine. The British refuse to allow immigration from Europe of the displaced Jews. They absolutely refuse it. So the Jewish Agency, which is the government for the Jews in Palestine, and activists in the United States and Canada raise money, buy ships, outfit those ships, sneak the displaced persons out of the camps across the borders to Marseille, to Italian ports, to Bulgarian ports, where they put them on ships and sail them to Haifa. Once they get to Haifa, the Israelis take the survivors and they put them onto other ships and they send them to Cyprus and they put them behind barbed wire in another form of displaced persons camps. But what's important is that the displaced persons, 20 to 30,000 of them, have left Germany. And they'd rather be in Cyprus, which is closer to Palestine, to their promised land. In 1948, Harry Truman, and this is my interpretation based on my research, Harry Truman understands that the American Congress is not going to let in the Jews, that a coalition of Midwestern Republicans and Southern Democrats are going to do everything they possibly can to keep the Jews out of the United States, to deprive them of visas. Truman recognizes at the same time that in order to establish an independent West German state, which is necessary as part of the Cold War coalition against the Soviet Union, in order to establish that independent West Germany, he's got to get the 250,000 Jews out of Germany. He can't give independence to Germany and say, okay, you've now got authority. These Jews have to follow German law, German police procedures, German courts. He can't do that. The world would not allow it. The diaspora Jews would not allow it. The Jewish voters would not allow it. So he's got to get the Jews out. And he realizes the only place is an independent Israel. And he supports the partition of Palestine under UN control, and then supports an independent Israel. When the independence comes to Israel in the spring of 1948, Israel immediately begins to move the displaced Jews out of the camps. And eventually, of the 200,000 displaced Jews, 150 to 200,000 of the 250,000 Jews, 150 to 200,000 go to Palestine. About 50,000 are able to come to the United States. And they go to Palestine, large numbers of them, not because they're Zionists, but because no place else on earth will welcome them. And large numbers don't want to go to Palestine because they've been through one war. They don't want to enter another war zone in 1948. But they have no choice.
Well, this story, I mean, it's a modern story, but it's also an ancient story. Mass population movements have happened since the beginning of history, of people fleeing war-torn regions. Their homes are burned down. In Turkey, where I lived for a number of years, there were many villages that only appeared maybe 100 or 150 years ago after Imperial Russia pushed Muslim populations out of the Caucasus or the Balkans or whatever, and they ended up in Turkey. But each chapter in history like this of population movements also has something that's unique as well. It's not the same as things that happened in the past. Is there anything unique that stands out to you when you looked at these displaced persons that are eventually able to settle in a new land, whether Israel or Australia or South America or elsewhere? Something that stands out to you about their experience of finally finding a place to settle after World War II?
The tragic irony of this is that the displaced Jews who resettled in Israel are resettled in apartments, in houses, in rural settlements, in agricultural settlements that Palestinians once lived in. And the Palestinians have either been displaced by the Israeli army, or they have fled the hostilities, and the Israelis won't allow them to return. So the Jewish displaced persons find homes only because the Palestinians have been displaced. I don't want to discount the suffering of the Jewish DPs, but their displacement lasted 3 to 5 years. The displacement of the Palestinians has gone on for more than 70 years and is now in its third generation. There's a story that is told in a new book on the Holocaust and the Nakba about two Jews who are sent to an apartment in Haifa. They had spent 5 years in displaced persons camps in Europe, and the Israelis offer them a new home. And as they enter this apartment in Haifa, they realize that it's fully furnished. There's food on the cupboards, that the places are set for a meal. And they understand that they are taking the place of a family that's been displaced. And they turn around and walk out the door and close the door behind them, because they're not about to do that. They were the minority. Most of the Jews didn't have the fortitude or the courage to say no when they were put into homes that were empty because the Palestinians had been displaced.
Well, this is an ongoing story, obviously. In the 21st century, we still have millions and millions of DPs. The civil war in Syria caused many to come to Europe and elsewhere, and all it takes is one nation with a large population's political and social system to crumble, and this starts all over again. So from what you saw in World War II and the immediate aftermath, are there any positive things that happened that you think we should remember, or large mistakes that happened that you think we need to remember so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past?
Yeah, I think the largest mistake was basing public policy, one, on geopolitical concerns rather than humanitarian concerns. We were more interested as a nation, and certainly our elected representatives in Congress, were more interested in stocking the nation with anti-communists and fighting the Cold War than in remembering the horrors, the victims, and the villains of the World War. We quickly forgot the horrors of Nazism to prepare for a Cold War. So that's the first lesson. We can't let geopolitical concerns override humanitarian concerns upon which this nation was built and still believes in. That's number one. Number two, we can't allow public policy to be determined by lies, by falsehoods, by errors. The Jews weren't all Bolsheviks, as they were portrayed. Large numbers of refugees who want to come to the United States now are not all potential criminals, gang members, terrorists. We have to have a fact-based refugee policy rather than one that's based on lies and misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you just said there, this is a historical story, but it's also one that is repeated over and over again and has a lot of contemporary relevance. And for listeners and viewers who want to check out more, the book is called The Last Million: Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. David, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.